A 21-mile stretch of water could decide whether your fuel gets more expensive, whether factories slow down, and whether a global crisis begins. That narrow stretch is the Strait of Hormuz. Through it moves roughly one-fifth of the world's petroleum liquids, and a huge share of the energy that keeps cities lit, factories running, and millions of vehicles moving. Now imagine Iran suddenly loses the ability to threaten or disrupt what happens there. The ships keep moving. The oil keeps flowing. But something far more important has changed. For the first time in decades, Iran can no longer use the world's most important energy choke point as a source of strategic pressure. So what happens next? Does the world finally become safer? Or does Iran find another way to make the world feel its power? On a map, the Strait of Hormuz barely looks important. It is a narrow passage between Iran and Oman, connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea. But every day, an extraordinary amount of the world's energy moves through it. In 2024, around 20 million barrels of oil and petroleum products pass through Hormuz each day. That's roughly one-fifth of global petroleum liquids consumption. Around one-fifth of the world's LNG trade also crossed the same waterway, much of it from Qatar. And this is where geography becomes power. Iran does not need to physically shut the strait to influence what happens there. The possibility of disruption alone can make shipping companies hesitate, push up insurance costs, and send energy markets into panic. And eventually, that pressure reaches people who may never have heard of Hormuz. A driver paying more at the pump. A factory facing higher energy costs. A family watching its electricity bill climb. Thousands of miles away, a decision made around a narrow stretch of water can quietly become part of someone's monthly budget. But there is a strange contradiction. The irony is that Iran's ability to threaten this strategic waterway also exists alongside its own dependence on the wider Gulf energy system and maritime routes. So do its neighbors. And so does much of the global economy. That is what makes Hormuz so powerful. It is not simply a passage that one country can control. It is a pressure point connecting countries that may disagree on almost everything else. For decades, the world has learned to live with that risk. But imagine the balance suddenly changes. Iran can no longer credibly threaten or disrupt the traffic passing through. The ships keep moving. The oil keeps flowing. And for the first time, the world begins asking a question it has spent decades avoiding. If Iran loses its ability to threaten Hormuz, does the world finally become safer? Or does Iran simply start looking for another way to make the world feel its power? Now imagine the change begins quietly. There is no dramatic announcement, no single moment when the world suddenly declares Hormuz closed or open. Instead, something more important happens. Iran loses the ability to make shipping through the strait genuinely uncertain. International naval forces increase their presence. Commercial vessels receive stronger protection. Surveillance expands across the waterway. And slowly, the calculation inside every shipping company begins to change. For a tanker captain, the question is no longer, could something happen here? It becomes, how much longer before this route is safe enough to use normally? Then one day, the message arrives. The route ahead is protected. The ship moves forward. And thousands of tons of energy begin crossing the water without the fear that once followed every journey. That distinction matters, because markets react to risk before they react to reality. If the threat of disruption begins to disappear, insurance costs could eventually fall. Shipping companies could become more confident. Energy traders could begin pricing in a lower chance of a prolonged crisis. But the first 24 hours would still be tense. Ships might wait. Governments would watch. Military commanders would calculate. And inside Iran, leaders would face a very different problem. The waterway is still there. The ships are still moving. But one of Tehran's most powerful sources of geopolitical weight is slipping away. And that raises the question that could define everything that happens next. If Iran can no longer use the threat of disruption around Hormuz to pressure the world, what happens when it starts looking for another way to prove that it still can? The first 24 hours would be tense. The first week would be different. Because once ships begin moving safely through the Strait of Hormuz, the consequences would start spreading far beyond the water. Inside a trading office in Singapore, analysts would watch every tanker crossing their screens. In Tokyo, energy companies would be calculating what secure shipping means for future fuel costs. In Europe, manufacturers would be watching the price of energy that keeps factories running. And ordinary people would feel the effects too. A truck driver paying for diesel. A family watching its electricity bill. A factory deciding whether higher energy costs make production profitable. For them, the Strait of Hormuz would remain invisible. But its consequences would not. Hormuz is not only an oil route, it is also one of the world's most important pathways for liquefied natural gas, with roughly 1/5 of global LNG trade passing through the strait. Qatar is especially important to these flows, with much of its LNG exports passing through Hormuz on the way to international markets. If the threat of disruption truly disappears, markets could begin to relax. But while the world watches prices, Iran would be watching something else. Its most important pressure point is gone. And now Tehran faces a choice. It could try to rebuild its regional influence through diplomacy and relationships. It could increase military signaling elsewhere. Or it could look for asymmetric ways to remind its rivals that losing the ability to threaten Hormuz does not mean losing all of its power. None of these outcomes is inevitable. But the strategic problem is real. Because history shows that when one path to influence closes, powerful nations rarely stop looking for another. And the world would soon discover something uncomfortable. Removing Iran's leverage over Hormuz does not remove the competition for control of the region. It only changes where that competition takes place. The question is no longer what Iran can do to Hormuz. It is where Iran might try to exert pressure next, and how the rest of the world responds. By the end of the first week, the crisis would begin changing shape. The question would no longer be whether ships can pass through Hormuz. It would be who is responsible for keeping them safe. That would place a new burden on the countries protecting the waterway. Naval forces would need to remain nearby. Surveillance would have to continue. Commercial ships would still need confidence that the route was secure, not just today, but next month and next year. For the Gulf states, the lesson would be uncomfortable. Their economies depend heavily on energy exports, yet the route carrying much of that energy remains vulnerable to regional conflict. Some oil can bypass Hormuz through pipelines, but those alternatives cannot fully replace the strait's capacity. So governments would likely invest more heavily in alternatives. New pipelines, larger strategic reserves, different energy suppliers, and eventually more renewable power. But while the world tries to make itself less dependent on Hormuz, Iran would be facing a different challenge. How do you maintain influence after losing the ability to threat one of the world's most important energy choke points? Because controlling a choke point is not only about ships passing through water. It is about proving that a country can still shape the decisions of others. And if Iran can no longer do that through the threat of disruption around Hormuz, it may have to find other ways to demonstrate its geopolitical weight. The answer would not necessarily be another dramatic confrontation. It could be diplomacy, regional alliances, economic pressure, military signaling, or other forms of asymmetric influence. None of these would automatically replace the strategic advantage Iran once gained from its position near Hormuz. But they could change the game, because the world might become less vulnerable to one particular choke point, while the competition for influence across the region continues somewhere else. And that is when the story stops being about who controls a narrow strip of water and becomes a much bigger question about how the world adapts when one of its most powerful pressure points no longer works the way it used to. Years later, the ships would still be moving through Hormuz, but the world around them might look very different. If Iran permanently lost the ability to threaten or disrupt the passage, the strait could become less a symbol of Iranian strategic power and more of an internationally protected artery. Energy markets could become less sensitive to the fear of sudden disruption. Gulf states could feel more secure, and governments that once accepted their dependence on one narrow waterway might finally invest seriously in alternatives. More pipelines, more strategic reserves, more diversified energy supplies, and perhaps more pressure to move away from fossil fuels altogether. But Iran would also have changed. Losing its ability to threaten Hormuz would not make Tehran powerless. It would force Iran to operate in a world where one of its strongest strategic cards no longer works the way it once did. Its influence would depend more heavily on diplomacy, regional relationships, economic pressure, and whatever other tools it could use to shape events around it. For ordinary people, the change might never be visible. A family filling a car with fuel, a factory keeping its machines running, a worker waiting for a paycheck. They might never know how close their lives once were to a decision made thousands of miles away. And that brings us back to the question at the heart of this story. Would the world become safer if Iran lost the ability to threaten or disrupt Hormuz? In one sense, yes. The world would be less exposed to one of its most important energy choke points being used as a source of strategic pressure. But it would not become immune to conflict. Iran would still have influence. The region would still have rivalries. And the competition for power would simply move beyond the narrow waters of Hormuz. Perhaps that is the deeper lesson. The real vulnerability was never simply Iran. It was the world's dependence on a single passage to keep modern life moving. Because the most powerful choke point is not always the place one country controls. It is the place the rest of the world never learned how to live without.